Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. Welcome to the third session of the early hours. And here, this is an expansion of the discussion on dhikr, a little more detailed discussion with regard to the types of dhikr. And the slide that's before us is pretty simple, easy to memorize or remember. Basically, it's two parts. That there are two types of dhikr, is that which we do when we find ourselves engaging in obligatory acts, and second, that which we find ourselves doing when we are engaging in recommended acts. I think that that is sufficient for any sort of program of self-development, that we have that concept clear in our minds, that there's things that the Sharia obligates and things that the Sharia recommends. And so when we are engaging in that process of self-development, and that's a two-part process. One, it involves removing those qualities which are negative and cultivating those qualities which are positive, right? And so we have to root those qualities and we have to develop them so that they stay part of our personality. And that comes with following some sort of routine. That routine consists of engaging in those acts which are fundamental, which are obligatory, and those acts which supplement, which are recommended and are also necessary, but they're not at the same level as those acts which are obligatory. First, remember the concept that we started off with, the issue of graduality, that how graduality is an important part of the process of self-change and growth. Well, we need to also understand that that self-change and growth, it takes place by undertaking actions, and those actions have to be in a program in which it is undertaken gradually. That's important to understand, that that program has to be undertaken gradually. And so he talked about the issue of remembering Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, and how remembrance of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, the focus of it is to impact the heart, and so that the heart can be living. And so then once the heart is transformed, then the whole of the self is transformed. And then we have a hadith which indicates to that meaning. And so in this session, I wanted to make it clear that actions overall, there's some of them which are obligatory and some of them which are recommended. And so there's also the concept of that which is prescribed, prescribed action, right? And so that is an idea which basically is simply put like this. The Sharia dictates to us how certain acts should be performed. That's it. The Sharia dictates to us how certain things should be done. The Quran and the Sunnah is what we mean when we say the Sharia. So the Quran and the Sunnah, they detail for us certain actions and how they should be done. And so that's important to understand, that these actions that are detailed, they're detailed with reason. Those are the actions that we are clear that are a program which is pleasing to Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, right? Which is pleasing to Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. In other words, we don't make up our path to Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, but in our journey to Allah, we follow the way of revelation, and the way of revelation, which is the Quran and the Sunnah, dictate to us that there's certain things which are pleasing to Allah and other things which are not pleasing to Allah. And so whether an action is obligatory or recommended, we begin with those types of actions before we begin with our own personalized, type of action, because these actions are the actions which are prescribed in the Sharia, they're detailed in the Sharia, the Sharia tells us how to perform them. We're certain that those actions, have impact. They're time tested and they are within the boundaries of what we would call prophetic education, right? In other words, they are from the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ. And so he talks about the individual program of dhikr, and he mentions the same thing. He says that, for the acts of ibadah, some of them are considered obligatory and some of them are considered recommended, right? And so there's things like outside of the 5 salawat, there's things like the sunnah salah outside of the fast of Ramadan, which is an obligation. There's things like the sunnah fast. There's outside of zakat, which is an obligation, there's sadaqah, right? Outside of the obligation of hajj, there's umrah, which is something that is recommended. And so, and that's in the, amongst the scholars, you find some discussion on that issue. We're not going to go into the details of that. But he wants us to understand that there's a ladder of ascent. The ladder of ascent in spiritual development has to do with following this program of understanding what is an action which is obligatory and what is that action aiming at. What are the objectives of those actions, right? And that comes with studying a little more, right? Studying especially the teachings of those scholars who teach us about the virtues of actions, about the spiritual benefits of particular actions, so that we can learn what are the goals and objectives of those actions, right? And so then that foundation is set with the obligatory actions, and then we build on it. We build on it by way of engaging actions which are non-obligatory, right? And so salah is one of them. Salah is one of them, right? And in the salah, we find ourselves that in the salah, we're ascending to Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. The Isra wal Miraj was that process by which Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala allowed the Prophet to ascend to his presence, to rise to his presence. And so within the teachings of Islam, we find that the salah is the ascent of the believer, how we come close to Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. So salah is foundational in that regard, right? And so then he talks about the necessity of preparing psychologically and mentally, for the salah as a practice. So that is something which demands that we know how to pray salah, that we're conscious of when to pray salah to Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, and that we're consistent with it, right? We're consistent with it. And so, that is something that is key, so that entails making sure that we're seeing how it is that salah is to be performed. We're planning for it in our minds. We say, I have to pray, I have to pray, I have to pray. And then we're preparing for it from the other angle of the practical steps. Do I have wudu? I have what's necessary for prayer? And so in that sense, he's talking about developing that state of preparation of mind to engage in that act of dhikr, which is prescribed on a regular basis, the act of remembering Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, which is the salah. And then there's another type of salah which is not an obligation. It was obligatory on the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but it's not an obligation upon us, which is the tahajjud salah. Remember that this book is entitled In the Early Hours. So the tahajjud salah is that salah which is performed later in the night, right? Some at times call it qiyam al-layl. And so, for instance, that salah is performed later in the night and is performed during a time in which Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala tells us by way of the teachings of the Sunnah that Allah is awaiting our prayers and supplications. Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala comes close and near to us during that time. It's a time period that's full of blessings, the third part of the night. And so he talks about the importance of establishing that within our lives. Then there's the issue of fasting. And fasting, we know, Imam Izzuddin Abdul Salam tells us that fasting cuts the way of shaitan to us. And what it does is that it blocks the means, right, of satanic influence upon us. Because during the time of fasting has certain rules. This is why we said that the Sharia prescribes actions. The Sharia tells us how to perform certain actions because certain results are to be achieved by performing the action in that way that the Sharia is telling us. And so fasting performed in the way that Islam dictates and the way that the Quran and the Sunnah dictates, what it does is it blocks the means to shaitan having an impact on us because it cuts the senses from being preoccupied with things in the dunya that are appealing to the desire. So the desire is the means by which shaitan finds a way to us, to attack us, to undermine us. And what it does in turn, consequentially, in effect, is give us willpower on a physical and spiritual level to be able to focus ourselves on that which is more important. So on things of the hereafter, deeds which will bring us closer to Allah, deeds which are constructive and not destructive. And it also provides for us security from shaitan, because we're not in that orbit of satanic influence. We're not in that realm where shaitan can influence us. We have cut ourselves off from many actions which can serve as a bridge to satanic influence. And so the fasting becomes a strong way of remembering Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, and also a way of purifying the self. The other means that he mentions is the recital of the Quran, or tilawah of the Quran. And remember that when we were doing the book called The Way to the Quran, which he also wrote, he talked about one of the prerequisites is that when we're reading the Quran, we're keeping in conscience who it is that is speaking to us, so that the Quran becomes the bridge by which we the bridge by which we establish a relationship with Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. And so this point here is important to note, that although he doesn't have a discussion on the issue of the obligation to read the Quran, by default, the heart which does not have dhikr is dead, and the heart which has dhikr is alive. By default, the position is that the recital of the Quran is one of the best forms of dhikr. It's that which keeps the heart alive, as well as other forms. Although he doesn't go into a detailed discussion of that, we find that, in the teachings of Islam overall, the abandonment of the Quran is a sign of deficiency in Iman, right? And it's a sign that puts us closer to being like those that are outside the fold of Islam than those who are in the fold of Islam, because after all, the Quran is revelation. The Quran is revelation. And so he also takes mention that the Quran should be a constant companion to us. And in this time of Ramadan, the Quran should be that which we recite with frequency and consistency, even if the portion is not much. But it's something that should keep in our minds, right? And so he talks about the issue also of dua. And so there's that dua. We have to understand that dua is considered to be the heart of ibadah, is the heart of the core of ibadah. And the salah itself is rooted in dua and the recital of the Quran. So that's one of the reasons why the salah is such a perfect form of worship, because it combines recital of the Quran and dua. It combines recital of the Quran and dua. And also within the Quran is the full person is engaging ibadah. The full person is engaging ibadah. And so along with dua, there's things like making tawbah. And to make tawbah is to repent to Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. There's repentance from major sins and minor sins. And so there's a specific formula by which tawbah is to be performed, right? And that is to make 2 raka'at to stop that sin that you're engaging in, right? To have, a sense of remorse and to intend never to return to that sin again, right? And that's the general form of the prescribed tawbah, especially for major sins, is an obligation to perform tawbah for major sins. Tawbah can be performed for minor sins, but is not prescribed. And so minor sins, is not legislated as an obligation, I should say. And so tawbah overall for minor sins can be achieved by way of dhikr. And so he talks about the whole concept of istighfar, that we should seek the forgiveness of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. Astaghfirullah. Right? And so that is a practice of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam that was practiced with frequency. And he says the process of dhikr must involve the recognition and confession of our faults, mistakes, and our deviance or aberration. And then it also has to, signify that we're turning back to Allah by asking for forgiveness and we're expecting mercy from Allah wa ta'ala, right? So, and the istighfar, is seeking forgiveness, while tawbah is turning away from our faults and returning back to the path of Allah wa ta'ala, right? And so that's something that's important to understand, the difference between the istighfar and the process of tawbah. And so we end on that note, and we ask Allah wa ta'ala to forgive us in this time. Astaghfirullah wa natubu ilayh.